Hey fearsome friends, some very disturbing stories for you today. Keep your good eye on the ball and avoid making stupid decisions. So sit back, relax, and get cozy, comfy, warm, because it's time to let your nightmares in. I've wanted to write about this for a long time. It's such a nuisance of a situation, and it seems like that any time I find a semblance of mental peace, this asshole comes out of the woodwork to make sure I still remember he's out there. This guy, let's call him Marvin, was in my circle of friends for a bit in high school and my early college years from late 2000s onwards. He dated a good friend of mine, Alice, and we'd hung out both with her and with other friends. Sometimes we'd smoke weed together, etc., but he and I weren't very close. He had an odd sense of humour, but I was kind of oblivious to the darker aspects of his personality, until he cheated on my friend at a party, according to his close friends, and lied about it. I was protective of my friends, and while I never interfered in their relationships, when my friend asked my input, I told her she deserved better than to be lied to. And to be clear, even his friends said this to her, but she continued seeing him as friends with benefits. We even hung out together in groups, but she mentioned to me many times that he's manipulative. Now, besides the cheating incident, she told me other instances of him acting callously. Once when he was walking with Alice and her best friend, who he didn't like because he thought she was ugly, they dropped off Alice, and instead of walking her friend home, it was dark out, he just ditched her without saying anything. My friend also told me the first time they'd had sex, while she didn't recognize it as assault at the time, looking back she realized he'd raped her. As in, he was very forceful, hurtful, but she didn't realize that was wrong because she was infatuated with him. He had a tendency to make silly, homoerotic jokes, and this wasn't uncommon with guys I knew at the time. He had gay friends and didn't have issues with them publicly. But I remember once, this gay kid had a crush on him and was sending flirtatious comments on MySpace. Instead of just telling him he's not interested and not actually gay, he flipped out, called him a slur and viciously insulted him in a tirade on his MySpace comment. Things started to get a little messier around 2010 to 2011, when one day Marvin got into a car accident with his mum having some minor injuries. Alice had a great relationship with her, so she visited them. I don't know the full context, but something about the way the interaction went triggered Alice to tell Marvin that she thinks he's a sociopath, which is probably the worst thing she could have done, but alas, out of my control. He's a good-looking and very fit guy, and definitely had some obvious narcissistic traits, but I'd never really learned much about sociopaths, besides watching Dexter. So when she told me and other friends about what she'd deduced, it was both eye-opening and a little freaky. We briefly worked together at a retail store, and I saw him getting close to the younger brother of a friend of mine from school who worked with us. He was a chubby kid with low self-esteem, and he admired Marvin's fitness and confidence. Marvin started working out with him, and this kid would always talk about how awesome Marvin is. Instead of just minding my business, I felt compelled to interject, and I messaged him one day just telling him to be careful about letting Marvin get too close, as he can be manipulative. This is among the biggest regrets of my life. Of course he told his idol what I'd said, and while we remained cordial, clearly he knew what had gone down. He eventually left the job, going into hiding after working a scheme to steal big-ticket items with help from several team members, including my friend's brother. Another time, Marvin and I were smoking weed at the house of an old friend of mine. My friend, let's call her Diana, was a very trusting person and an incredible host. I was high out of my mind, and Marvin was kind of schmoozing, being highly complimentary of my friend who hosted us. Again, my stupid, nosy, protective instincts kicked in, and I grinned and commented something like, "I know what you're doing." He was probably just earnestly making connections, and I assumed that he must have manipulative intent based on what his girlfriend had said. Alice told me that he's mentioned how I'm too judgmental and opinionated, specifically citing the incident at Diana's house, and he also didn't like that he felt I and our other mutual friends were trying to interfere with their relationship. But to be clear, I wasn't trying to hook up with his girl. I genuinely just didn't want to see my friend hurt. She continued seeing him as a friend with benefits long after people told her to be wary, and at that point I wasn't spending energy to try and nudge her. At some point, though, she did break things off for good with him. Now the timeline is a little messy here, but in between the above incidents, I got a text from Marvin saying he took acid and came to the realization that he's a sociopath. He then told me some sad story about his family and said if he can't make himself become empathetic and feel things deeply, he's just going to kill himself. Being naive and not wanting anyone to die, I told him there's plenty of people who just want surface-level connections, so he doesn't need to kill himself. He can just find other people like him. But looking back, I realize no one tells people they're a sociopath unless they're trying to scare them. And he probably told me this because he knew that Alice had talked to me. He never thought much about her intellect, and he probably figured I was the one who told her the theory that he's a sociopath. We fell out of touch after their full breakup, and him hiding after the theft incident, and I deleted his number. But at some point we connected on Facebook, and he basically told me he'd gotten addicted to coke whilst doing criminal business in Europe. He went to rehab and claimed a psychiatrist diagnosed him as a psychopath, of course using the term more likely to be linked to violent behavior, and one that's not even a clinical diagnosis. My stomach sank and I didn't know how to react. I asked him how it made him feel to know for sure, and he said it made him aware of his power. He then said he respects me and would never hurt me, but I blocked him not long after this. My last mutual contact was him texting me in 2012. His message was vague and provocative. It read, "I'm coming." I asked who this was, and he dodged the question to coax me to admit I knew. I asked what he wanted, and that I don't appreciate feeling threatened. He told me I was so defensive and that he just wanted to say hi. But I told him I think it's uncool that he's trying to mess with me because I have a weaker ego than him. He then said something strange about how I should never talk down about myself or something like that, but I blocked his number again. This was 2012, and since then 2 or 3 times a year I'll get Instagram follow requests from a new profile he's created. Sometimes it's obviously him, and sometimes it'll be a weird spam-looking profile, but following mutual or former friends. My heart rate goes up every time this happens. Sometimes I don't block right away, because I don't want to make it obvious how much this puts me on edge. I usually keep my social media on private, but one time I opened my Twitter so I could participate in some contest. And I kid you not, within 3 days, a faceless account only following a few accounts, many mutual friends of course, started following me. He's made Spotify accounts and followed me, and Spotify doesn't let you block people. So instead I just had to restrict what I shared. I've often thought of starting a podcast, but this whole ordeal has made me hesitant to ever want to raise my profile to the point of being found by him. A friend of ours committed suicide a few years ago, and I'm ashamed to say I almost didn't go to the funeral in case he showed up. I get terrified when I get calls from strange numbers, even before robocalls became so common, and I get worried that I'd bump into him when I believed we were both in my hometown at the same time. I don't know what his goal is, and that's what bothers me the most. Is this his punishment for me for getting involved in his affairs over a decade ago? On one hand, he's never made overt threats to me. He knew where I lived growing up, and I was there for many years after our last conversation. I spent many nights concerned when strange cars parked outside, but thankfully never had an issue. On the other hand, I don't know what he's capable of, and if he's connected to dangerous people. He's moved back and forth between our hometown and other places several times, and apparently changed his name along the way. My therapist suggested that perhaps he envies my large circle of deep relationships, as he clearly has issues with his own identity. It's disturbing for me that I'm still on his mind after a decade of not communicating. I keep praying that he finds something else to fill his boredom than making sure I don't forget he's out there. My friends have told me it's silly to worry about this, but it's hard when I'm having a good day and suddenly see an Instagram notification that sucks the oxygen out of the room. I spent years anxious and in fear because of his cruelty, and I honestly wish he kept his word about what he'd do if he couldn't find a way to be a normal human being. This story occurred a few years back when I was visiting Vegas for a friend's birthday. We were staying a few minutes from the Strip in an apartment-style resort next to a big casino that I can't remember the name of. Our group had planned to catch a limo in front of the casino to get to the Strip that night, and they'd left the room before us, as my friend and I's flight had gotten in late, and we needed a little bit more time getting ready. However, once we were ready and walking from the resort to the casino, I noticed that someone was walking behind us. It was a silhouette of a tall man, and he was with a few shorter guys. He wasn't too close though, and others were also heading to the casino from the resort, so I wasn't that concerned at first. But then I noticed him and his friends getting closer to us, and at a quicker pace. Then the men tried to talk to us, so my friend and I began to speed up. As we were approaching a gate when leaving the resort, the man loudly said to us, "You guys better hope that gate is unlocked." We nervously reached for the gate, and luckily it was unlocked. But holy crap, what just happened? A sigh of relief came over my friend and I, and we sprinted to the front of the casino where our friends and limo were waiting for us. Now fast forward to the last day of our trip, when we were at the same casino's buffet for our friend's birthday dinner. Everything was going well, until I saw a man walk past our table and wink at me. I thought to myself, what a creep. But it's Vegas, so I just shrugged it off. He looked to be in his late 40s and was accompanied by only much younger guys, who were maybe in their late teens or early 20s, if that wasn't weird enough. They didn't seem to be his kids either. He then walked by our table again and proceeded to sit next to my friend, who was wearing an easily identifiable birthday bitch crown. I told the man to please leave our table as he wasn't welcome, but the other girls who hadn't noticed him walk by earlier tried to calm me down and said not to worry about it. He proceeded to sing happy birthday to my friend and give her a kiss on the cheek, which I found gross, and the whole table was highly entertained by it. But my friend and I, who'd walked together the previous night, were not. My friend then suddenly turned to me and said, "You know, that guy looks really familiar." "How so?" I said, and she replied by saying, "I think it's the guy who tried to follow us out of the resort the other night." My eyes opened wide and realized it may have very well been them. The tall, skinny, older-looking guy with his shorter, younger friends, or whoever they were to him, walking together. The younger guys tried to talk to us at our table, but eventually left, thankfully. But the man would walk by several more times past our table and make it obvious he was looking towards my friend and I. We were officially creeped out now, and looked over our shoulder as we were leaving the casino. We were catching our flight shortly after, so thankfully we wouldn't be there much longer. Till this day, though, my friend and I tried to make light of it by joking around and saying how we'd avoided getting kidnapped. But this situation definitely had its darker tones. We tried to theorize why the older man was with the younger guys who closely followed him in the first place. Could this have been a trafficking scheme? We may never truly know and are grateful to have stayed safe. But let me know what you guys think. This happened more than 10 years ago, but I still wonder sometimes what would have happened. When I was a teenager, my favourite thing to do was listen to music, as it took me to another world, away from the chaos of my toxic family and school life. I listened to music during almost all of my free time, and one thing that really enhanced the music was motion. Walking, running, or swinging on the swings. I hadn't yet discovered driving, so swinging was my favourite way to listen to my music. At age 16, nearly every night between 8 to about 1 a.m, I would go out to the Swingset behind a nearby church and swing for hours with my headphones on. The darkness also enhanced the music, because there was less visual stimulus to distract me, and it was very dark. The street was well lit, but the church building blocked out all that light, and the swings were set pretty far back from the road behind the back parking lot. There was nothing but a dark field, the playground with the swings, and the empty parking lot. I kept my head on a swivel, as I had watched enough serial killer documentaries to have a healthy amount of paranoia. So every time I swung forward, my eyes would scan 180 degrees to the right. Then every time I swung back, I'd scan 180 to the left. Because of my vigilance, I felt quite safe and confident that I could spot anyone before they got too close to me. I had this routine for at least 2 years with no problem, but regardless, I never let my guard down. One night I was swinging away and noticed something unusual. At head height, poking around the side of the church, was a shape I hadn't noticed before. It looked like the head of a person who wanted to hide, but at first I couldn't quite tell. I locked focus on it until it disappeared back around the corner and out of sight. Then it poked back out, then it disappeared again. It did this several more times before I became absolutely sure someone was watching me who didn't want to be seen. At best, they wanted to steal my iPod and headphones, but it could have been something far worse. I didn't want to stick around and find out, though. I very casually got up off the swing and started walking back towards the street and around the opposite side of the church to where he was standing, and he immediately began walking straight towards me. I picked up my pace into a speed walk, but didn't break into a run, and he did the same. After walking fast for maybe a minute, with him close behind, I finally made it to the street, but he also reached the street at the same time, about 20 feet away to my right. Then he took off running down the sidewalk in the opposite direction. I was so freaked out, wondering what could have happened, and my heart was pounding. I went home and told my best internet friend about it, but he laughed and asked why I was so scared. I thought maybe other people wouldn't understand, and it was a you had to be there kind of thing. So I never told anyone else after that, and I didn't go back to that Swingset for at least 2 months. When I did, though, it was much less frequent, and at more random times. But I eventually stopped going altogether when my family moved away. My story takes place when I was about 13 years old, and I'm 19 now. I just moved into a small countryside town, into a house that was next to a huge forest. It was a newly built neighborhood, and there weren't many houses on my street. You could walk hours into the woods and still be going. So being young and stupid, I'd take my dog for a walk without my parents with me, or even a cell phone. But please don't blame my parents. They were reassured by the fact that my dog was really big, and people were easily frightened by him. My dog was about 7 years old, and this becomes relevant later. I did this often, and nothing bad had ever happened, and I'd never come across anyone. I loved it because I could really take my mind off everything that was happening in my life. Moving was rough on me, and to make everything more fun, I was being bullied at school too, so I really needed this time to walk and chill with my dog. So there I was, casually walking along a long track through the woods that's used for motocross and quad biking, when I suddenly heard a noise coming from behind me. I didn't pay too much attention to it at first, but it started to become louder. So I turned back, and that's when I saw a person coming straight towards me on his motorcycle. Now, I'm a 13-year-old girl who is scared of everything that seems out of the ordinary, so I decided to get off the track as quickly as possible and hide. Unfortunately, though, Henry, my dog, is black and doesn't blend in with the surroundings, so I began to walk fast, but could tell that the bike was closer now. I started running then and found a rock big enough for my dog and I to hide behind. I heard the motocross come and go, as it was thankfully impossible for whoever this was to see us. Then I waited, telling myself that I was being silly, and when I thought I'd waited long enough, I started walking again. However, just then I froze instantly when I heard a loud engine getting closer to us. Without hesitation, I started running like hell, and when I found somewhere to stop and hide, I did just that. My dog wasn't in the best shape though, so I was feeling really bad for making him run that much, but I could tell this person was getting closer and closer to me. It wasn't a dense forest, so he could follow me easily, plus he was so much faster. I'm a clumsy person too, and I trip on just about everything. So when I met this lovely branch, I fell on the ground pretty hard after tripping on it. I was so full of adrenaline though, I just got up and carried on running. He was now only meters away from me, so he could see me and was clearly chasing me. There was no doubt about that. If he'd gotten hold of me, I was sure something bad would happen. We were approaching a more dense part of the forest now, so the guy had no choice but to stop, and this gave me an advantage. I was able to get away from him more easily now, when just then a wave of relief washed over me. I could see a house. As I got closer though, I could see it was still under construction, so there was no one living in it. I managed to find a hiding spot behind a fence nearby, where minutes later I saw the person come up really close. I could tell he couldn't see where I'd gone, and I felt that wave of relief again when he started to leave the area. I think I hid for about 30 to 40 minutes without moving, to make sure he hadn't come back, then found my way home and told my parents what had happened. They thought I was being overly dramatic, but in the end I never knew who this person was, and I did hurt myself, but nothing too serious. I heard years later about weed that was being grown in a part of the woods, so maybe I'd gotten too close to something regarding that, and they saw me on their cameras. I also went back there with some friends once I was a bit older, and we found a small abandoned house that was not too far from where this happened. So this story goes way back to 1998 when I was 16 years old and was with my two other friends, who I'll call Ben and Jake. It was a late summer evening on a Saturday, and I was sitting in my room listening to some 80s rock, as teenagers did back then. I got bored though after some time, so went out to meet Ben and Jake. We were chilling in Ben's garage for a while, drinking beer and smoking pot, when we all got bored pretty quickly and went out to do some teenage stuff. I remember we were walking down this narrow path by the woods and down towards a lake. Now back in the late 90s, there was a popular hangout spot for teenagers there, so we were hoping to see some other kids. But when we arrived, there was no one, except the sound of the crickets in the tall grass. We sat for a while on a bench and talked for about 15 minutes, when Jake wanted to go to an old fishing hut by the lake. We all agreed and went to it, walked inside and explored. Whilst Jake and Ben were walking around and breaking things, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. We made our way up the stairs where there was an old wooden boat with a fishing net lying over it. As we were kind of checking it out, all of a sudden we heard the wooden door to the hut creak open and could hear heavy footsteps entering down below, followed by heavy breathing. We all stopped dead in our tracks and almost held our breaths, when there was around a 5-second break of silence that felt like an eternity, when suddenly a man spoke in a drunken voice. "I know you're here," he chuckled. Come out wherever you are, you little brats," he continued. The heavy footsteps made their way towards the stairs as the old floor creaked underneath, so Jake got inside the wooden boat, and the rest of us followed. We put the fishing net over us and didn't move a muscle. Then the man arrived upstairs, and we could hear him stumbling around. "I can hear you," he laughed again. We were sitting dead still, but I could feel the fear in all of us as the man walked around, moving stuff. I was thinking of a plan to escape without being caught, but we were literally like sitting ducks. Suddenly we could feel the fishing net being ripped off. "Here you are," he pounced. Jake reacted the fastest and pushed him away hard enough that he fell onto his back. Then we all ran like hell out of there and through the tall grass into the woods. We could hear the man give chase, but quickly gave up, probably due to his drunken state. We went back to Ben's garage and fell onto the couch with exhaustion. Jake then told us that the man had dropped a knife when he fell to the floor, and we all just sat there in shock for the rest of the night. To this day, I can't help but wonder what would have happened if Jake hadn't pushed the guy away. So this just happened last night when I'd popped into the Kroger on my way home from work. It was a little late, around 9 or so at night, and I was just trying to grab a few bagged salads and whatnot for dinner. As I was walking in, what looked like a homeless man, but I can't be sure, was also shuffling into the store from the opposite direction. I didn't think much of it, but I noted it as I always do. Always got to be aware and cautious as a smallish woman alone at night. I'm a tattoo artist, so I don't exactly have the look of someone you want to mess with, but I'm also only 5'2", so always better safe than sorry. I was shopping in produce, and he was shuffling by me. Then I went to the freezers, and he shuffled by me again. I remembered then that I needed more produce, so I went back and there he was again. At this point I honestly just thought, poor guy, it's pretty cold tonight. I bet as a homeless person you have to stay on the move and keep walking around, and you could get away with several hours in here, I bet. So I wasn't creeped out at all yet, but I did note that he had no basket or cart and no products in his hand. Again, I just assumed he was warming himself up. I finished my shopping and had seen him a handful more times, and I went to the self-checkout. I'd barely started scanning my shopping when he began checking out at the register next to me. As I said, it was late and no one was behind me waiting, so I was kind of taking my time scanning my always too many groceries, which is why it was weird that he was still there a few minutes later. He still hadn't had a cart or basket to check out. Then I glanced out of the corner of my eye and saw him just standing there pushing buttons on the screen. He was reaching into his pockets like he was paying, but he wasn't ringing anything up. That set my alarm bells off, and I looked around to take note of anyone else around, security or other staff. And behind me at the bagged ice, a man was standing in a yellow vest. I think he was a cart pusher, but it was a guy I'd not seen until now. I go to this store a lot, and I saw that he was mouthing numbers to the homeless man. 2240. I glanced back at the dude behind me, and he was staring right at the vest guy, who then started making small hand gestures back to him, like they were communicating something. At this point, neither of them were looking at me, but there was someone on either side of me. I still wasn't sure if I was just being paranoid, so I gathered my groceries on my arm and pretended to fumble inside my wallet, sending change everywhere. Both men began picking up the change for me, and whilst they were bent over, I just said, "Oh, thanks, don't worry about it. I'm in a hurry and gotta go." Then I practically sprinted out the door. Neither of them followed me right away, and there was no one parked near me, so I flung all the groceries into the passenger seat and was pulling out only seconds later. By the time I saw Shuffling Man come out of the store, looking left and right like he was looking for me, but also maybe just to return my change. I'm still not sure if I'm reading too much into this, as it really could have been nothing. But I keep calling it my near kidnapping, which I hope is an exaggeration. So I'm still in high school and work for a family member on certain weekends at a college, selling concessions at the stadium. I do it once or twice a month, and the stadium is located towards the edge of town. It was a Friday night, and I had just gotten out of school. I had to go straight to work, and I was working a half shift of 4 hours, when my boss, who was my aunt, told me we needed more spoons for tomorrow's event. We sell ice cream, and these events have up to 5,000 people. I said, "Okay, I'll grab them on my way home." Now the only store open with heavy-duty spoons is all the way on the other side of town, and I still wanted to meet up with some of my friends and hang out. So I decided to take the faster but more sketchy way around the outskirts of town. Now I live in a bipolar weather state. It snowed last night, but I figured the roads would be fine, even if they hadn't been ploughed. So I took off to the store, and the first 5 minutes went by smoothly. I hadn't seen a single car or any buildings for the entire journey so far. But keep in mind, it was approaching 9 p.m, and I was on the outskirts of town. No one really took this route unless they really had to. All of a sudden then, I saw something in the corner of my eye that looked like a man at roughly 5'8", and he was wearing shorts, a t-shirt and a backwards hat. He was in the ditch walking in snow when it was only 10 degrees out, and my first thought was to pull over. But I was on the phone with my mom at the time, and she warned me not to, as some horrible things have happened before in this town. For example, a couple of years ago a college girl was kidnapped and found dead, rolled up in a rug. Now I wasn't too worried at this point. I was a young dude driving a big pickup truck. That's the last type of person anyone would want to try and harm, right? I passed the man going about 40 miles an hour. Like I said, roads aren't the best. And I drove not even 500 feet past him, when immediately, a car that I hadn't seen at all before then, turned onto the road and pulled out of a field entrance and began to follow me. At first I thought I had just been focused on the man in the ditch and hadn't seen the road where he'd come from, but I later found out there was no road. Now again I wasn't super worried. I watched my fair share of crime movies and read plenty of stories, and didn't feel there was a threat yet. So I carried on my journey to town and had to take some turns to get where I was going. I turned left and the car behind turned too. Then I turned right and they followed. I went around a roundabout and skipped my turn going around another time, and the car still followed. At this point I began to worry a little, but maybe they were just going to the store as well. I now wasn't in the best part of town, and pulled up to a stop sign. I then turned without using my turn signal, and again the car followed. Now I know I should have gone straight to the police station, but I still didn't think too much about it. I was 2 miles from the store, where plenty of people would be, and after I took a few more turns, the car continued to follow me. I completely blew a stop sign at a non-busy intersection, and the car did a quick stop and go and caught up. By this point I was only 2 turns from the store, so I still wasn't worried. Finally I arrived at the store parking lot, and the car turned in as well. There's also a gas station at this store, so I pulled in there first to act like I was getting gas, and the car sat off to the side of the road, in between the gas station and the store. I waited for about 10 minutes and the car didn't move, so I started to get even more worried. I was a young kid alone at night near the bad side of town, so I called my friends, the ones I was supposed to be meeting up with later on, and gave them the license plate of this car just in case. Then I took off to the store. I crossed the street and the car came up straight behind me. I was freaking out on the phone, not knowing if I should call the cops or not, and I parked as close as possible to the store. The car parked 3 rows behind me and a couple down. It was getting late now and the store was closing soon, so there was only a couple of other cars in the lot. I decided then to turn my track back on and park on the opposite side of the lot. Then I got out and bolted inside of the store. Now I'm not super overweight, but I'm not skinny either. I'm about 6'1" and 200 pounds, so who would want anything to do with me? I got the spoons, but took my time in the store. I then went to call my friends as I walked back outside, but my phone was completely dead. Looking outside through the sliding doors, suddenly there was a white van next to my driver's side, looking like no one was in it, but the back windows were covered and it was running. Big red flags were flying now, so I ran to customer service and explained everything. But they thought I was some young kid messing around, and at the time I hadn't seen the original car that had been following me, but there was no way in hell I was going outside with that van next to my truck. After waiting what seemed like hours but was only 30 minutes, the van pulled forward and the original car appeared from the side of the building. You can see from the in-store Starbucks window that they were talking. Then both of them drove off. I waited another 10 minutes and dashed outside. Then I sped to my friend's house, and when I got there I parked in his garage, and one of my buddies asked why there was a big orange mark on my tire. My heart sank. When I was inside, the car must have marked my tire, and after inspecting the rest of my truck, we found a small pipe had been dropped into the bed of my truck surrounded by snow. It was about 2 inches wide, I'd say about 18 inches long, and wrapped in duct tape. It was not mine. I had been alone with no phone and in a part of town I wasn't familiar with. I tried to laugh it off, but now that everyone was asleep, I couldn't help but think of what could have happened if I'd walked outside. I've always had a boosted ego due to the fact I'm a chubby fat dude that no one would want to mess with. But after tonight, I realized that anyone can be targeted. So I, a 13-year-old female, has kind of a weird home life. My mum is very paranoid and she's very protective of my sister and never lets her go out alone without her or dad. It kind of goes for me too, but only because she doesn't want my sister to do the same. She screams and curses at us whenever we say we want to go out alone or together, and says that we'll be abducted or trafficked. Crazy nonsense like that. She literally thinks that as soon as we step out the front door without her, we're going to be kidnapped or something. Of course I find what she says ridiculous, but also, inevitably, it made me paranoid too. Even my sister would always have the emergency number on her phone whenever a car passed by us. But it's not like I'm scared to go out at all. That is, until today. I was really bored and had nothing to do. So I decided to go out for a walk, not too far from the house. Of course my mum was against it, as she said things like, "I hope you die so we will never see you again, and I hope you get kidnapped." I was used to it by now, so I just ignored her and went out anyway, and I took a right from the house and casually walked aimlessly. As I was walking along, I looked behind me to make sure there were no cars, and I spotted a minivan driving very slowly from a distance. I didn't think too much of it and just carried on my walk. After a while I looked back again, and it was still driving at the same speed. Now I don't know anything about driving, but I think if someone was in front of you, shouldn't you change direction? Like, I was walking on the right side of the street, shouldn't they go from the left? There was enough space for them to get by me, so I found it suspicious and was creeped out by it. But I also found it funny how I was so paranoid that I didn't take it that seriously. I walked a little more, frequently looking behind me. I even looked directly inside the vehicle, when just then I suddenly remembered what my mum used to say to me, and I became scared. I fastened my pace a little and went to stand by an entrance of a building. Then the car suddenly stopped. There was a wall obstructing the view, so the vehicle wouldn't see me, and I sneaked a few glances at it. It didn't move at all, just stayed there. I could still hear the engine running and nobody got out, so that made the situation even more terrifying. Now I knew I had to get back home, but the vehicle was still parked there, as if waiting for me to go back to the street. I knew I couldn't go back there, but I didn't have a cell phone on me, so I was stuck. Suddenly the door of the car opened, and a man got out, picking up some pink handkerchief from the ground, then made direct eye contact with me before getting back in the car. I thought, maybe that handkerchief was stuck to his tire. That's why he didn't move. But even after he was inside the car, he didn't move, and I could feel him still staring at me. I was so scared and I didn't know what to do. So I went and hid behind this blue car, hoping he would leave. Then after a few seconds, I heard his car move past me, and as soon as it left, I ran for my life and made it home. I don't know if this was just a misunderstanding, or if that person really did have bad intentions, but I don't think I'll be able to go out alone again. I'm a 21-year-old woman, and this happened a while back, so some of the details are a bit hard to recall, but it has had a huge effect on me and was very traumatic. Back in 7th grade, I had a middle school boyfriend who was called Kevin, and we went to a really small religious school. Being new to a school where everyone grew up together, I felt relieved to have someone I could talk to and sit with at lunch every day. Kevin was my first kiss, and the relationship was pretty innocent, except for a few instances that made me feel really uncomfortable. We shared a notebook that we would trade off to each other in between classes to leave cute notes and drawings. And one day, I had just finished running the mile for my gym class, and I handed him the notebook. But when he gave it back to me later on, he had written something about how my pheromones had really turned him on. I had no idea what that meant back then, but still felt somewhat uncomfortable about it. And he had also tried groping me a few times. He seemed a little off, but was really well liked at my small school, so I figured it was just me overthinking the situation. As time went on, though, the relationship ended, like most middle school relationships do. A while after we had broken up, we still talked on the phone occasionally and remained friends, but he began calling my home phone constantly, even in the middle of the night, which obviously annoyed my parents. Eventually I stopped answering as often, realizing that he was becoming obsessive, and around that same time, I was laying in bed one night, and around 1 or 2 in the morning, I heard a knock on my window. My blinds were closed and my bedroom was on the 2nd floor, so I was very confused about what I was hearing. But the knocking continued, and then I heard someone say my name. I had no idea who was on my roof knocking at my window, and I was freaking out, so I ran to my parents' room to wake my dad up and told him, "Dad, someone is on the roof and they're knocking on my window." My dad ran outside to try to catch the person, but didn't see anyone. So I went back to bed thinking I was just imagining things. But it happened again a few minutes later. My dad went back outside and didn't see anyone, but this cycle continued for another 30 minutes, until eventually my dad decided to sleep on the floor of my room with me just in case. I really thought I was going crazy. A week or so later, and the calls from Kevin continued. I answered at one point, and eventually he told me he was the person knocking on my window. He said that whenever my dad would come outside, he hid behind my chimney as he wanted me to let him into my room, telling me he thought it would be romantic, like Romeo and Juliet. I told my parents and stopped answering the phone entirely after that. Now I can't remember how far in between these next few instances happened, but it gradually escalated as more time passed. I would avoid him at school, and he didn't make much of an effort to talk to me, thankfully. Then at some point I changed schools to go to a public middle school instead. During the beginning of the school year, I was asleep in my bed when my mum pounded on my door, yelling at me to lock it because someone had broken into our house. I jumped out of bed to lock my door and hid in my bed under my covers, paralyzed with fear and trembling as I strained to hear what was happening outside. I could hear my mum screaming for my dad to ask if he was okay. Then a few minutes later she grabbed me and my sisters and locked us in my parents' bedroom. Apparently my dad had decided to sleep on the couch that night because our dog was acting strangely and annoying him, and as he was sleeping, my dog started barking and losing his mind. See, up until that night, my dog had never acted that way, so my dad got up to investigate. He found Kevin leaving our basement and saw that our basement window had been broken. He yelled for my mum and woke her up as he put Kevin in a headlock, and she called the police. He'd broken the basement window with a hammer, taken his shoes off, left them on the window ledge, then jumped down from the window, landing on broken glass. He'd left bloody footprints all over the carpeted stairs and was heading up with a hammer when my dad found him. I still don't know what his exact intentions were that night, but it terrifies me to think about it. When the cops arrived, they took him out in handcuffs, and I spied on them as they told my parents that the look in his eyes was the look of someone who would grow up to kill his parents. His eyes were wide and insane looking, and it was one of the most terrifying nights of our lives. We later found out he'd ridden his little sister's bike for several miles in the middle of a storm to get to my house. I was able to get a restraining order against him after that, but he never had to pay to repair the window and only did community service. After that, my parents decided to get security cameras for the inside and outside of our house, along with motion detector lights. A while after the break-in occurred, maybe a month or two later, my neighbour called my parents in the early morning to inform them that he had gone outside and smelled spray paint. When he went to see where the smell was coming from, it didn't take him long to realize the entire outside of our house had been vandalized. There was a giant smiley face on our garage door, with something along the lines of, "Your daughter is a whore," written on the side of our house. There were also random lines and doodles all over the doors and windows, along with spray paint on the security sticker on the basement window we'd just recently repaired. Whoever had done this had apparently hidden behind my neighbour's car and also gotten paint on it. We checked the security cameras whilst waiting for the police to arrive and saw footage of someone that was Kevin's height and build spray painting the windows. What's even more terrifying is when we watched the footage from before that. It showed me walking downstairs in my underwear and a t-shirt to get a late night snack, with who we assumed to be Kevin watching me from the window outside. It had rained that night, so despite having the spray paint cans and security footage, the police weren't too positive that they would be able to get a fingerprint from the cans and said the security footage wasn't clear enough to say it was for sure Kevin. But I know it was him, and he never got caught, and my family had to pay thousands to fix the damage he'd done to our house. The harassment continued for years after that, despite me having a restraining order against him, and by the time I was in high school, he had made countless fake accounts on social media pretending to be me. He posted really embarrassing things and followed everyone at my new school, so I constantly dealt with people asking if the accounts were me, which turned into bullying and even more harassment. I would get messages from him saying, "I know where you are, I'm watching you," and threats of him saying he was going to kill me. This went on for another year, until thankfully he finally stopped. He later ran an anti-bullying campaign and never had to face the consequences of his actions. He'd put me through hell, and I can't even begin to express how terrifying those years of my life were. All the time it was too much to handle, and I ended up in a mental hospital after a breakdown. I wish I could say I've healed from that time of my life all these years later, but I still struggle with the aftermath of the trauma he caused me. I have panic attacks when I get message requests. I keep my blinds shut and doors locked at all times, and any knocking noises on my window causes my heart to jump. I'm so upset he gets to live his life and not deal with any consequence of what he'd done to me and my entire family. And what's worse is people from my old school loved him and still do despite knowing what he'd done. One person messaged me years ago and said I was lying, and even if it was true, it was my fault. Seeing the love he still receives despite acting the way he did fills me with so much anger. I'm just hoping writing about it and telling this story helps me to continue to heal. At the time this happened, I was 13 years old, and it happened 2 years ago. I'm a female and was fairly naive at the time, and I was a major introvert, having only a few friends in my class. I wanted to be more social. I just preferred to be alone to read or write. Classic nerd things. In early November, I got a text on my phone that was from a few classmates whose phone numbers I had and recognized, and around one or two I didn't. It was a group chat, asking if we wanted to hang out at night near a park at our school, but my parents, being strict and paranoid, would never let me go. Luckily though, or what I thought was luck, they were heading out for an overnight trip, and they would be back around 4 in the morning, so everything fell into place. Once my parents left around 8ish, I ran out the door and made my way to the park. The one thing I made sure to do was lock the door. My parents were paranoid after all, and it was the biggest thing that they'd engraved into me. Once I arrived at the park, I noticed a creepy figure near the edge of the woods, but no one else seemed to notice it. I already had enough of a reputation as a weirdo who was true crime obsessed, so I didn't mention it. The night drew on, and I was having the time of my life, ignoring the gut feeling I had telling me to run. But every so often I would look over my shoulder, and the man would still be standing there. Around 9:45, 4 out of the 10 people there had to leave due to their curfew, and it was getting cold and was nearly pitch black with a few streetlights on. So the rest of us decided to go as well, since it felt more eerie and quiet without them. The place we were hanging out at was a field that was fenced in with a few exits and entrances, with a large white field with a small park in the back and our giant middle school behind us. The front of the field faced the empty road, and the right and left sides were surrounded by forest. All of the people that left were getting picked up, so that meant they'd gone the opposite way of the road, as that's where the parking lot is. And the man stood by the right forest road exit that I needed to take to get home. I walked away from my group then, and tried to steady my heavy breathing. I didn't want to be paranoid, but all the true crime I'd listened to was catching up with me. The man was probably early 40s, late 30s, with dark hair and a beard, and he was probably around 5'9". But at the time it seemed like 6 foot. He stood about 10 feet from the exit I had to take, so when I got close enough to it, I ran for about 30 feet through the exit and through the woods. And once I felt safe enough, I started to quickly walk through the woods, or at least get to the road, when I suddenly heard a snap and a crunch from behind me. I stopped walking for a second and quickly checked over my shoulder, and around 15 feet behind me stood the very same man. He was slowly following behind me, almost as if he was trying not to be suspicious, but it only made my fear worse. I turned around and walked so quickly I was basically jogging. I lived about 10 minutes away from the park we had hung out at, and I wasn't athletic enough to run home. But after around 7 minutes, I was finally in my neighborhood. I knew that I could run to my house if I had to, so I checked to see if he was still trailing behind me. And to my horror, he was only 5 feet away. I ran. I ran faster than I've ever run before, and I could hear his footsteps thumping across the concrete as he ran too. I then dove down an alleyway I knew well and tried to lose him in a park, making my way home longer. But I could hear his heavy breath followed by his footsteps as he tried to keep up. I cut through houses, backyards and front yards when I finally made it to my house and flew up the steps. I looked behind me, and he had just arrived at the bottom of my stairs, so I unlocked the door and burst through it, shoving it closed behind me, and I heard him hit the door with his whole body. I ran around the house and locked all the windows, turned off the lights and hid in my bedroom with a kitchen knife, just in case he got in. He didn't, luckily, but if this was a better world, that's where my story would end, but it doesn't. After a few months, I haven't really told anyone what had happened, as I didn't want to get in trouble with my parents for sneaking out. But I didn't go out with anyone or any group again, and my loner status returned. I began to write horror stories as a coping mechanism, and never went out past 7 p.m. Then it was around February when a classmate of mine was sharing a story of some random man following her home on the bus. She described him as being almost the exact same as the man who had chased me. Another girl mentioned that he'd sounded like the guy who stood outside the school and tried to follow her home, but I didn't join in with the conversation. Everyone just agreed that he was just some weird guy, and it was kind of forgotten about. I eventually moved on too. That is until around May time, when I was getting ready to walk to school. My mum pulled me aside and showed me a picture of a man, and it was the guy who had stalked me. She told me that he had been arrested 2 weeks ago for sexually assaulting a child and had escaped last night, so told me to keep an eye out for him and to call the cops if I saw him. I was shaking the whole time I walked to school, and it haunts me to know that if he had caught me, I would have mostly likely been in her position, or even dead. I used to work in an industrial area that tends to be secluded and dark at night, with minimal lighting along the roads. I also live close to this previous job, so I would walk home instead of taking the bus, as I can't drive, and the bus routes tend to be awkward and have long wait times, so I usually just walk. One night in early October, I had been walking through a parking lot to get to my place. I had to walk through a few parking lots to get there, actually. However, they closed to the main road where these incidences occurred, and as I was walking through a desolate parking lot, I was listening to music when I got this weird feeling that I should look behind me. I did so, and saw this individual who was wearing a hoodie and track pants and appeared to be a woman. The person was pale and seemed to be watching me after they'd emerged from the bushes and trees they were hiding in. She picked up pace from behind me, but continued walking horizontal to me. I picked up my pace and ran across the main road, when I looked back and I could see her standing next to a set of trees. She'd realized that I'd seen her watching me, and jumped behind a tree to hide. I went into some random apartments to hide from her and wait there for a bit. Then I left and made my way to my place. On getting in, I told my mum about what had just happened, and she said that I should have called the police. But it doesn't stop there. It was early November, a month since the last incident, and I had a weird feeling that there was someone in the parking lot that I was walking through at the time. It was a different one to the normal one I walked through, as it had freaked me out that someone had been watching me. But as I walked through, the person wearing a hoodie emerged again, but this time from hiding behind a parked trailer, and she was talking on her phone. I was now thoroughly freaked out, so decided to pick up the pace and get to the main road as fast as possible without alerting this person that I felt threatened. But as I was getting ready to cross the road, this person crossed too and was watching me. I booked it to the random apartments from before and hid in there until I assumed she was gone. Now, the last time this happened was mid-November, only a week after the second incident. I was walking through the same parking lot that I'd seen her in the second time. Dumb, I know. And she emerged from behind a trailer, walking straight towards me. I decided to just run and get to the main road, and as I got across I looked back and she was gone. I assumed she must have been hiding behind the trailer, as there was no way she could have gotten out of the parking lot in that time. So I decided to hide in the same apartment building as before, again. I've not seen her since, as it's been snowing, so it would be significantly easier to see her face, and it's too cold to wait out in the parking lot. I also no longer work there, so I no longer have to take that route to work. But thinking about it, it could have been a man, as they were pretty tall. But I thought I heard her voice when she was talking on the phone, and when I saw her the first time, I thought she might have been a white female with dark hair. I haven't gone to the police with this information, but I might. I doubt it will do anything, but my mum thinks it's still a good idea. This happened back in 2010 when I was 21, and my best friend and I had blown off any sort of responsibility for a whole summer, choosing just to party instead. It's probably no surprise that by the end of the summer, we were both evicted, we were roommates, and now condemned to our parents' houses until we got our lives together again. One night, we were at my mum's place playing Left 4 Dead. It had gotten to about 2 a.m. when my friend Cam decided to call a cab and head back to his mum's place. He had to use my phone to call the cab company because he'd forgotten to pay his bill. Yes, I know, we were real winners at this point in our lives. And this was also the days before Uber and Lyft. So you'd have to call the station, and they'd call for a car over their CB radio. About 15 minutes later, we could see the cab waiting outside, and he got in and left. 10 minutes later, I got a call on my cell phone from the cab company. I knew the number by heart, so I knew it was coming from the central station. And when I answered, there was a woman on the line whose voice immediately sent shivers throughout my body. "This is Badger Cab calling for Cameron. His cab has arrived." I was confused and responded with something like, huh? "Tell Cameron to come outside," she said. The voice was echoey and distant, like it was an auditory house of mirrors bouncing around a frog-drenched void. I wasn't sure why the voice was creeping me out so much, so I tried pushing it aside and just told her that he'd already left about 10 minutes ago. And that's when I glanced out the window and saw a car idling outside on the street. It was parked a bit to the right of my house, so all I could see were the brake lights. I figured dispatch probably sent an extra cabbie by accident, so I told her I was sorry, but there must have been a mix-up because he'd already left. But the woman responded almost like she hadn't heard me the first time. "Tell him to come outside," she repeated, but this time with a rigid bite in her tone. "He was already picked up," I repeated. There were also a few weird noises for a second, like wind was blowing into the microphone. Then the call dropped. I redialed the number to the cab company, and this time it was a man who picked up. I told him what had just happened, leaving out the creepiness of the voice, and let him know they must have sent 2 cabs by accident. "I don't have any female cab drivers out tonight," the dispatcher told me. I thought to myself that maybe it was a guy with a high-pitched voice, but he told me that the driver picked up my friend just fine a while ago, and that a cab driver wouldn't call through their landline like that anyway. When I told him there was a car idling outside, and reiterated that there was 100% a woman calling, telling my friend to come outside and get in her car, he started getting very creeped out and worried. We both figured that someone had to have spoofed the cab company's phone number, as it's pretty easy to do. But that didn't leave us with any comfort. Why was someone spoofing a cab company's phone number and waiting outside their customer's pickup location? How did she even know that Cameron had called for a cab? I hadn't talked to anyone, and Cam didn't have a phone. The dispatcher radioed his driver and made sure he had Cameron and that everything was fine, then let me know he was safe and almost to his destination. The dispatcher and I talked on the phone for a couple of minutes then, trying to brainstorm as to what the hell could possibly be happening. And from his perspective, it's almost like someone was following and trying to lure a customer into their car, which is probably not good for business. After Cam made it to his mum's house, he called me on the landline there to ask what was going on. The only logical explanation he could think of was that it was this stalker he's been dealing with for several years. He had a restraining order on her because she would follow him, break into his apartment and wait for him to come home, and would do all sorts of weird, creepy stuff like that. But I'm not totally convinced that's what was happening. How would she have known he had just called for a cab on my phone? How would she have known where my mum lives? If he were leaving my actual place or the place of one of our close friends, then that would be plausible. But we were pretty tucked away on the outskirts of town in a suburb. My mum has a different last name than I do too, so she couldn't have Googled it. But it's the most logical explanation either of us could come up with, so it's the one I'm betting on until someone throws out a better theory. To paint the picture, it was my freshman year at Portland State University, and it was around October-November. It was cool and breezy, a perfect night for sneaking some alcohol past the RAs in the Broadway residence hall. A handful of friends and I got together and decided to meet at a new member of the group's dorm whilst her sister was away, and pass the time with some rosé and apple sours. See, at Broadway, the RA would do nightly rounds to assure the noise levels were okay, no lower classmen were in the upper floors, and no alcohol was being drunk or drug taking was going on, etc. By about 9 p.m, and being the klutz I was, I spilled my sours all over a blanket, causing the smell to attract the RA on their round. Long story short, we all got written up, had to dump what we had left, and called it a night. So a friend and I, who I'll call D, went down to the notorious Mac's shop downstairs to chain smoke, and rave about how the night was still young, and it was a damn shame the fun had to end. We were met with an older man around 30s to early 40s, who seemed nice enough, as they all do, and he'd overheard how the night was just as young as we were, and if we were down, he would pull some cash for beer and we could all drink together in his penthouse. Now Dee and I chalked up this penthouse to be total BS, but the promise of free beer already had us reeled in, so we walked to the Wells Fargo on Southwest 5th and Hall, and he grabbed his funds and got some booze from Mac's. We made our way over to the dark park blocks, and Dee and I hyped up so we could continue our buzz and get drunk for free. Now if you live in Portland and have college friends, or went to PSU, you know of The View, which is an apartment building. So heading in the direction of the art museum, he unlocked the front door to The View, and Dee and I were now convinced he wasn't blowing smoke about having a penthouse, and we went to the elevator with this stranger. Lo and behold, he pressed the P button atop at the long list of numbers indicating each floor. We were heading up to the penthouse. We arrived at his door, Dee and I holding each other's hands in excitement that we were in a goddamn penthouse getting drunk, and we sat at the center of the man's living room, having the smallest of small talk about law and order. He was telling us about how he affords the penthouse from his fish and chip food cart in the South Park blocks by the PSU library, etc. And we were basically working our way through as many beers as we could, as we admired the cityscape from the balcony before leaving, paying most of his words and talk with no mind. So we headed out to the balcony and looked overhead, smoking and raving to our group chat about what we'd gotten ourselves into, and how we were enjoying ourselves immensely. The whole time we were at this man's table and on his balcony, he was texting or calling somebody or several people on his phone. But we considered it to be no issue, until after about 20 minutes into basking in the penthouse views, when we noticed a lady, not too well kept, was sitting on his couch, talking with him. He told us to take a seat, and we hesitated, but we eventually sat down, me on the farthest end of the couch from the mysterious lady, and Dee next to the guy as she tried to down her beer and text the group chat for someone to call in a few minutes with an excuse for us to leave. Now that we've had as many beers as we could, we wanted out of there. The guy then leaned in towards Dee, telling her how beautiful her eyes are, and he suddenly dove in for a kiss, which she dodged amazingly fast. She mumbled how she isn't okay with it, and that our friend T is actually her girlfriend. I rambled on how it was true, and how I have a boyfriend, which was also a lie, but it sounded good at the time, and the man then put his hands on his face, stood up aggressively, and swiftly enough to bump his table and knock over everything that was on top of it. "What the hell? You have 5 seconds to run before I rape you all," he said aggressively. Dee and I exchanged frightened looks, and she said, "What?" before I yanked her arm, grabbed our phones and bags, and we ran to navigate to the elevator. We frantically ran down the hall completely petrified, and made it to the elevator before we remembered there's a poor lady in there now alone and locked in with him. We contemplated calling the police and our friends for help, or saving the lady. But we ultimately decided simultaneously to run down to the lobby, where I left 3 maximum capacity voicemails to our aforementioned friend T, who didn't answer, and once we'd realized it was now 3 a.m, and none of our friends were awake, we tiptoed back to his door and overheard the two laughing. Apparently the lady is a regular of his, either a sex worker or his own personal sex buddy, and he had called her over to convince us to have a threesome or foursome. He exposed, though, that he wanted to keep Dee around a little while longer, and that was enough for us both to hear, run back to the elevators, run back to our dorm buildings, and try to sober up to piece together how we'd gotten ourselves into that situation. The next morning our group chat blew up over what happened, us not recalling much after the alcohol, and our brains trying to block out what we did comprehend, but didn't want to discuss. Our friend T played my voicemails over and over to the friend group, with it being laughed at over time once the seriousness had died down. I'm unsure if that man was the guy that ran the popular fish and chips cart right outside the PSU library, or if the food cart is still there to this day. I dropped out of college after just one semester, so I paid no mind during that time to ever verify if the man was telling the truth or not. I still bounce back between Portland and whichever new state I choose to reside in. I might just go one day to see if it's there, to see if he's there. All I know is I never wish to see that Penthouse Predator in Portland, Oregon, ever again. Hey, thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed my video. And if you did, could you please give me virtual hugs by subscribing and clicking that notifications button. I also have a Patreon page and YouTube channel membership if you'd like to support me further. Thank you again for being here. Keep being creepy.